yeas are 98, the nays are 2. The bill is passed.
On July 27th, the United States Senate passed a new bill imposing another round of sanctions on Russia, along with Iran and the DPRK. If passed, the sanctions would be the largest and most comprehensive against Russia since 2014. Will Donald Trump use his power of veto on the bill, and what will be the consequences if he does? In response to sanctions from the US, President Putin has announced that 755 staff must leave US diplomatic missions in Russia, bringing staff levels to 455, the same as Russia's complement in Washington. Putin said he could not see the tensions easing anytime soon.
We had hopes that the situation would change, but it looks like it's not going to change in the near future.
Where is the Russian-US situation headed? The DPRK missile crisis is a huge challenge to the US and the region. Following US-Russia escalations in tension, what change in stance on the DPRK could Russia take? How will both countries balance common interests and disagreement? The EU openly complained about the new sanctions against Russia adopted by the US Congress. Why is the EU so nervous about this, and will the issue redefine Europe-US relations under the Trump administration?
Vladimir Putin ordered the United States on Sunday to cut its overall staff of more than 1,200 in Russia by 755 people. The Russian president took the action in response to new US sanctions imposed against Moscow for its alleged interference in the 2016 presidential election. It is believed to be the single largest cut ever imposed on the US embassy in Moscow and consulates elsewhere in Russia. This has triggered a dangerous escalation in US-Russia tensions, raising concerns about the Ukrainian crisis, Syria, and dealing with the DPRK. To discuss these issues and more, today I'm happy to be joined in the studio by Cui Hongjian, researcher of European Studies of the China Institute of International Studies, and Harvey Zordin, freelance columnist for China Daily. We shall also speak to Pavel Falkenhor, defense analyst in Russia via satellite. That's our topic. This is a dialogue. I'm Yang Rui. Harvey, what do you think of the immediate response from Rex Tillerson, Secretary of State, after the Senate announced its sanctions, and particularly after President Putin vowed to cut the size of American diplomatic staff in Russia from 1,200 to 7? I mean, it's a big cut. It's perhaps the most dangerous. What do you think of the consequences?
I think, on one hand, as he said, it puts the bilateral relationship, under a very serious strain. This pressure was building up for a long time, since last year. On the other hand, it's not only going to hurt America, it's going to hurt Russia. Which Russians is it going to hurt? It's going to hurt the local staff. Most of the people in the embassy who are going to be let go are local staff who won't be able to find jobs because they're tainted, having worked for America. And on the other hand, Russian citizens, will have difficulty getting visas, and the wait time will be much longer. So it's not, it's a complicated picture.
Last year, before Trump, the presidential hopeful, won the power, Barack Obama, former US president, asked Russian diplomats to leave. And yet, surprisingly, Mr. Putin exercised utmost restraint. Are you surprised this time around such major cuts were announced by Moscow?
Exactly, I'm not so surprised with this response from Moscow to Washington, because as we know, even in last year, after the President Obama, gave a very, serious response to this, as we know, this Ukrainian crisis. And at that time, I think that for Mr. Putin, he wanted to have maybe one more chance, especially after the new president in United States take the power in White House, perhaps because at that time we know that it looks like Mr. Trump wanted to try to, change the relations with Russia. But at this moment, I think that it's time for Mr. Putin and Russia to give some, tough response. Because as we know, once this sanction bill passed by the Congress and the Senate in the United States, frankly, there is not a few instrument in the hand of Russia to give some tough response to these sanctions. So I think to give some diplomatic punishment from Moscow will be one of the I think best options for Moscow.
Many observers compare the frosty relationship between Washington and Moscow to the very bad relationship between the Soviet Union and the United States during the Cold War. Do you think the two countries are likely to go back to the very bad mistrust between the two superpowers at the height of the Cold War?
This is exactly a replay of what went on during the Cold War, these kind of tit-for-tat diplomatic maneuvers that each country engaged in during that period of time. And there is a possibility that it can go back to that terrible time and that these relations can get worse. My feeling is that depending on what happens in American domestic politics, that it won't be long-lasting and that there will be a change. There will still be things that we can agree on, like our cooperation in Syria. So I think the jury is still out on which way that can go.
Let me go to Pavel Falkenhor, the Russian commentator, for his analysis on what's going on between Washington and Moscow. Hello.
Hello.
Are you surprised that your president
Hi.
has made such a dramatic decision and so many American diplomats have been asked to leave Russia very quickly?
Well, actually, Russian authorities have given the Americans up to September to decide who leaves and who does not leave. And right now, the Kremlin spokesman today, Dmitry Peskov, said that he's perplexed. The Kremlin is perplexed. What is really the American attitude, the attitude of Donald Trump to the new sanction bill? So Russia is a bit right now perplexed what really Americans are trying to do and what is the American official policy right now.
Do you think the European Union has been taken aback by this bill of the US Senate?
Oh, some people in Europe, yes. The European Commission Chairman Juncker and some of German politicians, especially from the Social Democratic Party, with close connections to Moscow and to a German business that makes business with Moscow, they are highly critical of this bill. Others in Europe apparently are not so critical. The opinion is that they will have to discuss this with America because this is, of course, a framework bill. It's not actually new sanctions announced, it's a codification of existing sanctions and also making them permanent, that the White House the president can't abolish them when he decides to. But the president has the power to impose sanctions under this bill.
Pavel, taking the German Chancellor as an example, Madam Angela Merkel said that she wants to take the destiny of the European Union into their own hands, and they should no longer bet their future on the whims and uncertainty of a newly elected US president like Donald Trump. Therefore, do you think the European Union will undertake a new style of diplomacy in what could be called a process of rapprochement instead of fueling new tensions between Russia and the European Union?
Well, Chancellor Merkel was very disappointed when she met with Trump in May and then in June and July, and had made public her discontent. But this is not yet a major political change, because the European Union is a very complex animal. There are different countries there, those who see that the United States, still the United States as a bulwark of defense against what they perceive as Russian threats, say Poland, the Baltic states, Romania. In Germany, there are different attitudes. In other countries, also in Italy and in Spain, they think have other opinions. So for the European Union to work out a coherent policy of steering away from the United States, well, that is not yet really on the card. It's just a kind of discussion.
Thank you so much.
And of course, there's going to be elections in Germany in September.
Hong Jian, do you think this dramatic bill by the U.S. Senate will be a game changer, and transatlantic relationship is likely to be undermined, since a defiant Angela Merkel vowed not to seek as much help from the United States leadership as before?
Well, I don't think this new sanction bill from the United States against Russia, as we know, it open wound, between these transatlantic two sides especially. But I don't think it would be a new point for a new chapter for this transatlantic relation. But it would be part of it. If we look at especially recent happen, now it looks like once there is always some disputes between President Trump and the Congress, Senate, and even singly from these uncertainties or unpredictability of President Trump. Certainly there will be maybe a new type of the transatlantic relations. Especially at this moment, I think why European Union and Germany, they have a so tough response to this new bill from Washington is, it looks like firstly, I think that it raises worries from Brussels, from Berlin, that there will be a new trend of this unilateralism by the United States. Of course, this time it's not from Mr. Trump, it's from this Congress and the Senate. On the other hand, that how could this new competition on economy and energy between Europe and the United States?
That's exactly what I was going to say about the energy. I think the new wrinkle here is the energy wrinkle. In Trump world, it's a zero-sum game. There's a winner and there are losers. And Trump always wants to be a winner. So with this sanctions bill, what it's doing is increasing the competition between former cooperators, former allies. And if you look at this Nord Stream 2, this pipeline that's being built, which is covered by the sanctions, if you look at that and see that the United States has an economic interest in bringing in its own energy sources, sources such as shale gas and liquid natural gas. And look what industry the Secretary of State came from. So I think that this has driven a great wedge between EU and United States, unfortunately.
What you say reminds us of the U.S. reluctance to punish Saudi Arabia in the wake of the September 11th terrorist attacks, because many perpetrators of the crimes actually came from that kingdom in the Middle East. Having said this, how likely is it for President Trump to veto this bill from the Senate?
It doesn't matter.
It doesn't matter?
Because it's a veto-proof bill. It's veto-proof because his party, the Republicans, who support him 80%, although 38% of the American public support him, but his party voted overwhelmingly for this bill. So among all the members of Congress, 535 members or so, there were only 5 people who voted against it. So if there were a veto by the president, it would be overridden. So it doesn't matter if he vetoes it or not. And the latest news today was that, according to Secretary of State Tillerson, that the president's not happy with this bill. So even the president's been going back and forth, as he often does, on what he's going to do and if he likes the bill or doesn't like the bill, etc.
Hong Jian, do you believe the current bad relationship between Washington and Moscow is a blessing and relief for most of the Chinese, because they were afraid, particularly on the campaign trail when President Trump, the president hopeful, apparently wanted to court Russia, wanted to improve relationship with Moscow to hopefully alienate Russia from China, to punish China for whatever reasons. Do you think this is a consensus that Russia and China should stand together as united as before, and it's a futile attempt by President Trump to hammer a wedge between these two permanent members of the UN Security Council, and President Putin and President Xi Jinping will stand together and share their vision about the world?
Exactly. As I know, now it looks like at the beginning it's just an issue between Russia and the United States, and of course with the European Union inside, as we know, as a very important stakeholder. But I think that undoubtedly it will have a very big spillover effect to the whole, international system, including China and some other players. We will suffer something from it. I think to some degree, the European Union's response is correct to point out that, firstly, I think not only European Union and also China and Russia and some other, players should work together or cooperate to fight against any kind of, effort of unilateralism from Washington. Another issue is how about this instrument of sanction to damage the international cooperation in economy, energy, and some other fields. As we know, it's correct for European Union to say that, okay, it's a kind of extraterritorial behavior by United States, which means that it's just as we know, domestic law will give a very big and negative impact on this energy cooperation for some other economies. I think for China, yes, we do have a very, very good and close relations with Russia, but I don't think it's just an issue between China and Russia. It's an issue, between United States and some other, players of the international community.
I think President Trump has shown great leadership on behalf of China, because I think he's driven China into Russian arms. And we've had, a month ago, a $10 billion deal, but done in RMB, so it evades U.S. sanctions, of Chinese aid to Russia. This is not going to please America. I'd say that these kinds of fissures will happen more and more, and that President Trump is driving China into Russian arms.
Thank you so much. Let me go back to Pavel. The first stage of Joint Sea 2017, a Russian-Chinese naval exercise, began recently, including live firing of big guns. Now, this is taking place in the Baltic Sea, which borders 5 of America's NATO allies. How will Trump and the U.S. government view China and Russia's newfound friendship? And this mil-to-mil ties between Moscow and Beijing is gaining momentum, actually. Not only this, Chinese warships also participate in your naval festival in St. Petersburg. I don't know where it took place, but President Putin was present, and he reviewed the joint naval parade. China and Chinese Navy was part of that. Pavel.
Well, yes, the Chinese ships were there in the Baltics, and they were in St. Petersburg, and Putin was there, and of course right now Moscow and Beijing are kind of demonstrating to the world and to Washington that they are partners and friends. And of course Beijing and Moscow do have common interests, but also they have different interests. Their main interests are actually not that really close. They're not against each other, but they're not absolutely close. For the United States and for China, the main issue, most likely the most burning issue, is the Korean crisis and the problems of North Korea that could develop into an actual hot war in the Asia-Pacific region. For Moscow, the Korean issue is a very side issue. For Russia, the main problem is Ukraine and what's happening in Ukraine and the fighting there and how Ukraine is going to go. It's going to go west, or Russia will return it to the Russian kind of fold. That's an issue that is not very interesting to China at all, and for Trump also most likely that's also not the most important issue. So the thing is that these countries have their own interests. They kind of declare themselves to be close, but not always. They move in the same direction simply because each has its own interest to bear.
And do you think elsewhere, for example, in the Middle East, Pavel, there's no chance for Americans and the Russians to join hands in rebuilding a war-torn country of Syria? And to what degree do you think Russia will display more of its defiance in this part of the world? And maybe Russia would also refuse to work with the United States in fighting ISIL, and the chance of such partnership is likely to be eroded as a result of the bill from the US Senate.
Well, there's going to be cooperation. There is cooperation between Russia and the United States in Syria. Both sides would want to see some kind of semblance of a ceasefire there, some kind of semblance of a normalization, quote unquote. And of course, the kind of suppressing the leftovers of the so-called Islamic State. But then again, these are kind of very limited spheres of cooperation. The future of the Middle East seen from Russia and Moscow very differently, though right now both sides want to see that maybe that issue pushed a bit aside. If there's a ceasefire, they can take more notice of more important issue, like for America, Korea, for Russia, Ukraine. So the short-term cooperation, yes. Long-term joint kind of concert-style action, I don't believe that that is really on the cards.
Look, Pavel, I'm more interested in one of the points you made just now, that our national interests, Russia and China, may not against each other, but they are not so close either. What do you mean by that? That reminds me, for example, of what Putin said recently on the military build-up in Russia. For example, he said he would not allow any other navies to surpass Russia, and the understatement suggested strongly that it could be a message for China. Russians would not allow the Chinese Navy to surpass Russia. And in this particular area, we see more sensitivity and not necessarily competition or rivalry. But I'm just responding to what you said about national interests on both sides. Russia and China may not be so close. What do you mean?
Well, they're saying India, Russia supports and sells arms to India. And India and China right now are rather have a tense confrontation there in the border zone with Bhutan. Russia supplies arms to Vietnam, and has interest in Vietnam, and these also kind of the issue of territorial rights in the South China Sea. The Russian Navy actually never saw China as its main problem. They were always targeted mostly on the West and on the United States. But the Russian Army has always seen China as a possible future threat, and still is running exercises in the Far East and in Zabaikalia, which are actually exercises of some kind of ground war on the borders of China and Manchuria, somewhere there. So yes, of course, this is a partnership, but this is not a very close union from both sides. And the Russian main interest is still in the West, not in the East. And the Chinese interest is in the East. And so in some areas they coincide, in other areas they're looking in different directions. Right now Russia and China are not really at loggerheads much anywhere, but that doesn't mean that they fully are supporting each other. Say in Syria, Russia would want China to go in maybe
Pavel,
and play a more active role. China does not want to
excuse
do
me,
that.
Pavel. During the Mar-a-Lago
Yes.
summit, President Xi Jinping said to the American host that we have 1,000 reasons to have a very friendly relationship between Washington and Beijing. We don't have a single reason to destroy the friendship between the two largest economies. At the same time, Pavel, if you ask Chinese privately, off the record, many of them would say, hey, let's give a second thought to the friendship or the relationship between Moscow and Beijing. They don't quite trust Russia. Given the history between our two countries, we signed 3 treaties. They could be called the Mutual Defense Treaty with Russia, either during the years of Tsar or Stalinist era. We gained nothing, and we suffered a lot. We suffered heavily. And therefore, we have a strong reasons. I mean, we, quote unquote, some of the skeptical voices from China said we have good reasons not to trust Russia. What do you think of the intricacy here?
Well, of course, the United States and China have so much economic mutual interest to figure out somehow their relationship without going into a major confrontation. So it would be very hard to imagine them really. It should be something very, very serious, because the fallout is going to be terrible for both. Russia-Chinese economic ties are much lighter. But right now, politically, of course, they seem to be cooperating together, though again, this cooperation is also with its bumps, especially still with Russia still believing that it is the nuclear superpower like the Soviet Union, but of course today's Russia is not the Soviet Union. So this is a bit of a kind of bumpy strategic partnership, on very pragmatic, on some issues yes, on some issues less, and that's most likely how it's going to continue.
Thank you so much, Pavel, for being this part of dialogue. Very quickly, Harvey, I believe you must have followed very closely the conversation that I had with Pavel. What do you think of the partnership instead of alliance between Moscow and Beijing at this defining moment in reconfiguring the post-Cold War economic and political order?
I think there's a lot that separates the two countries. I think this is why the two countries have not been able to agree yet, although they've tried very hard, on a joint action plan, because their spheres of influence are overlapping. Those spheres of influence are the Belt and Road countries and the stands in Central Asia. And so each side sees that as their sphere of influence, and it's going to be very hard to reach an agreement competition.
Your take, Jie.
Yes, I think that we need to take a difference between this so-called alliance or the kind of a partners between China and Russia. I think that's also maybe an advantage for this partnership between China and Russia is both two biggest countries, they can keep some space for their own foreign policy or some other. But of course, at the same time, this kind of cooperation and a partnership will give a very great help for this balance of strategy.
Hopefully, this policy of ambiguity between the two major countries, Russia and China, will give enough margin for our imagination in the process of reconfiguration geopolitically. I'll see you next time. Goodbye.